Ah, Lewis, I see you.
Okay, thanks. Hi, everyone. Okay,
Hi.
first continue. Okay, here we are. Good morning. Okay, let me mute myself. No, I mean.
Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you may be. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It is with great pleasure that I welcome you to this webinar entitled SIDS and Tourism, Propelling Resilience Forward. This webinar is co-organized by the co-chairs of the UN Steering Committee on Partnerships for SIDS in collaboration with the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs, the UN Office of the High Representative for the Least Developed Countries, Landlocked Developing Countries, and Small Island Development States. My name is Patrick Mifsud, and I will be moderating this first segment. For the smooth running of this event, may I kindly request all participants to keep their microphones muted and to unmute themselves only when given the floor. Participants are encouraged to submit any questions or remarks via the question and answer function at the bottom of the screen or via the chat function. We look forward to your questions and your comments. I would like to start off this meeting by inviting Her Excellency Vanessa Fraser, Permanent Representative of Malta, to make her opening comments. Ambassador Fraser, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Patrick. Excellencies, dear colleagues, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's a privilege and an honor to formally open this webinar within the framework of the Steering Committee on Partnerships for Small Island Developing States, which Malta is currently co-chairing together with Antigua and Barbuda. The scope of the Steering Committee is to assess existing partnerships and explore new ones impinging on the challenges of small island developing states and the implementation of the UN Sustainable Development Goals and the fulfillment of the aims and objectives of the Samoa Pathway. Needless to say, the single challenge that all SIDS have had to face, contended with, and deal with since the start of this year has been and continues to be the COVID-19 pandemic. Perhaps even more prejudicial than the actual health effects have been the exponential repercussions on SIDS tourism industries. Tourism is, of course, and by far, the most important contributor to SIDS national economies, foreign exchange inflows, and employment. Already facing substantial challenges from the effects of climate change, resulting in impending loss of beaches, coastal inundation, degradation of coastal ecosystems, saline intrusion, and damage to critical infrastructures, the pandemic has wreaked havoc with an unprecedented disruption to travel, affecting both tourism destinations and source markets for tourism, bringing them to a standstill. The devastating repercussions on SIDS are enormous, particularly on employment and businesses. This is affecting disproportionately females and youth, who tend to be the most hard hit with the tourism industry across SIDS. By virtue of the fact that tourism is linked to virtually all other sectors of the economy and society, this situation will most probably impact progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals, stalling processes already in place, hindering advances, and, in the worst-case scenarios, even reversing such progress. It is in this context I look forward to a useful discussion today that will allow us to share our experiences of how the COVID-19 pandemic impacted our tourism sectors, which measures and partnerships have been effective, and which not, with the ultimate objective being the identification of those partnerships that can strengthen the resilience of this crucial sector. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for these opening remarks. I now invite the distinguished representative of the UN Department for Economic and Social Affairs to deliver his remarks. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Patrick, for moderating this meeting. Ambassador Fraser, Ambassador Webson, Ambassador Young, distinguished co-chairs, excellencies, my dear colleague Fatika, High Representative of UN for SIDS, LDCs, LDCs, distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen. Today's discussion is the second in a series of global SIDS partnerships webinars, organized under the auspices of the SIDS Partnership Framework. It is an integral part of the UN Steering Committee on SIDS Partnerships approved work program for 2020. I commend the co-chairs for the choice of this topic and their efforts in organizing this event. Tourism is the economic lifeblood for most SIDS. This event provides a practical platform to exchange experiences, best practices, and lessons learned among SIDS and their sustainable development partners. The collective aim is to encourage the formation of new, genuine, and durable partnerships for recovery of tourism sectors in SIDS. Excellencies and distinguished participants, as we speak, COVID-19 pandemic continues to rage, sparing no region and threatening to inflict the worst recession since the Great Depression. It has plunged the world into an acute health and economic crisis, the severity of which has not been seen in nearly a century. The pandemic has exacerbated the vulnerability of SIDS and the inequalities within and among countries, and it has caused unprecedented disruption in international tourism. International tourist flows have fallen dramatically, and destinations that rely on the sector for jobs, economic well-being, and foreign exchange, such as small islands, will be hit the hardest. On average, tourism accounts for almost 30% of GDP of most SIDS. This share is over 50% for the Maldives, Seychelles, St. Kitts and Nevis, and Grenada. Tourism is also a prime source of employment in SIDS. Its multiplier effects are felt through hotels, resorts, restaurants, transport, retail, and agriculture. Of course, women are also more likely to be entrepreneurs in tourism than in other sectors of the economy. Now, unfortunately, they are affected. National and regional SIDS airlines, which are the essential conduit for tourism to these far-flung islands, and other tourism-dependent enterprises, are also facing significant damage from a prolonged loss of revenue. Revenue losses, reduced operations, and global travel restrictions could mean diminished tourism even after virus recedes. Excellencies, the global collapse in international tourism has exposed the economic vulnerability of SIDS. For many SIDS, this shock had the potential to develop into a massive loss of jobs and a sharp decline in foreign exchange and tax revenues. This in turn will diminish public spending capacity, which affects the ability of governments to deploy necessary measures to support livelihoods through the crisis, thus adding to already severe debt pressures. But excellencies, we should not underestimate seriousness of this crisis. We have seen the resumption of tourism in some domestic markets, but it would take time for international markets, including in SIDS countries. But we should remain confident in the future. In conclusion, let us strengthen the long-standing cooperation and partnership to assist SIDS in their efforts to respond to the pandemic and to fortify their sustainable development efforts. I hope you will have a fruitful discussion on how we can together map out our way forward. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for these most pertinent remarks. It is now the turn of the distinguished representative of the UN Office of the High Representative for the least developed countries, landlocked developing countries, and small island developing states to take the floor. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Your Excellencies, Ambassador Webson of Antigua and Barbuda, Ambassador Fraser of Malta, co-chairs of the steering committee, my colleague Liu Zemin, Under-Secretary General of UN DESA, Her Excellency Ms. Lois Young, Chair of AOSIS, Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, I warmly welcome you to this webinar on SIDS and tourism, Propelling Resilient Forward. You have heard it over and over, and I say it again, a perfect storm is ravaging the SIDS with the COVID-19 pandemic, with unsustainable external debt, with ever increasing and ever faster climate change impacts and natural disasters. Havoc is wreaked with the lives of people and the efforts to also achieve the sustainable development goals in and for the SIDS. Against this complex picture, how do we propel resilience forward? We have two options. We simply cave in and leave the people of the SIDS behind, or we act now to ensure that the people of the SIDS join in the path towards sustainable development that member states globally agreed on with the Agenda 2030. We are all here to know how tourism is a key strategic sector in employment, income, foreign exchange earnings, and thus fiscal revenue generation for the SIDS. This was also clearly articulated in the United Nations Secretary General's brief on COVID-19 and transforming tourism. The collapse of tourism is beyond evident. The fiscal space to service debt and to address urgent short and long-term socio-economic and health services for SIDS citizens is not there. How to weather these storms? How in this climate can SIDS emerge able to receive tourists again? Economic diversification is a must. However, just as is the case for other economies, for many SIDS, this is more of a long-term solution requiring huge investments in infrastructure and human capital. For many SIDS, these investments are simply not available nor accessible. We must stay realistic on what can be done given the comparable disadvantage of remote islands in a competitive global market dominated by a few very large players. Diversification and resilience building are possible within the tourism sector. Here, I wish to point to the efforts such as climate-proof infrastructure and hotels, diversifying source markets and tourism products, as well as developing SIDS partnerships around risk sharing, such as cooperatives. In the current global shutdown of the tourism industry, SIDS will undoubtedly need genuine and durable partnerships to recover and emerge more resilient than ever before. Development partners have a key role to play. There has to be a transfer of technology, experience, capacity building, and support is to be provided for resilience funds that could channel debt service payments into much needed investments in tourism. So with these few words, I now look forward to learning more about your experience and ideas to promote partnerships in the tourism sector in SIDS. OHR LLS is preparing for the Global Business Network Forum later this year, and today's event is a very timely input to that meeting. At the forum, we will discuss on oceans partnerships with the private sector to enhance resilience in SIDS, including as it relates to sustainable and diversified tourism. I look forward to your frank and important contributions to this webinar. My special thanks go to the Malta Small State Center of Excellence for its support to the SIDS Partnership Framework in organizing this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam High Representative, for these comments. To close off this institutional segment of the webinar, it is now my pleasure to give the floor to Her Excellency Lois Michelle Young, Permanent Representative of Belize to the UN and Chair of the Alliance of Small Island States. Excellency, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator, and good morning to everyone. Under Secretary General of OHR LLS, Ms. Utoya Kamanu, Under Secretary General of DESA, Mr. Liu Zemin, distinguished co-chairs, Excellencies, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I am pleased to join this important discussion. At the outset, may I thank the co-chairs of the SIDS Partnership Steering Committee, Island Voices Global Choices, and the Malta Small States Center of Excellence for convening this important event to discuss SIDS and tourism, propelling resilience forward. It should come as no shock to any small islander that the Secretary General's policy brief on tourism discloses that tourism is one of the sectors most affected by COVID-19. In a rather general statement, the brief states that no country has been spared the decimation of their tourism industry. And indeed, international tourist numbers can decline from anywhere between 58 to 78% by the end of 2020. However, when that industry, that tourist industry, represents as much as 90% of the exports of a small island developing state and accounts for 95% of its employment, as is the case in many SIDS, a generalized statement of overall international decimation could elicit blanket solutions. These solutions, simply put, may not be workable for the majority of small island developing states. Representing Iuwto, I have already spoken at numerous events on the impacts of COVID-19, and now, having reviewed the slate of options deliberated upon by Ministers of Finance in their meeting on the 8th of September, I cannot hide my disappointment that the international system is not responding to unquestionably the special case of SIDS. Lost incomes and lost jobs need real solutions, not platitudes and pipe dreams. I do not disagree that proposals suggested in the policy brief for transforming tourism make good policy. We can all agree on the need for crisis management and risk mitigation, boosting competitiveness and building resilience, fostering sustainable and inclusive green growth, strengthening coordination and partnerships. But these are premised on the existence of sound macroeconomic fundamentals. As Iuwto explained painstakingly in our debt statement, which can be found as a UN document at A/74/043, those conditions do not presently exist in our countries. I will not repeat our principal asks in detail, but as a reminder, in order to get to the point where we can effectively implement these policy suggestions, we need a suite of responses in the short, the medium, and long term, which must include access to liquidity for all SIDS on grant and concessional terms, debt workouts inclusive of private creditors, and debt for development and debt for climate swaps. We need a SIDS compact, SIDS solutions built on the SIDS experience. I appeal to our partners to consider how best to support the improvement of the fiscal position of SIDS in order that we can more robustly prepare for a reopening of our economies. The Maldives proposal for a bilateral fund and the ECLAC Resilience Fund proposal are steps in the right direction. SIDS simply do not have the liquidity needed to manage the socio-economic crisis and maintain a sustainable debt position. I also wish to emphasize a few areas addressed in the SG's brief that can support our preparation for the reopening of the tourism industry in particular. These areas could benefit from partnerships involving different stakeholders. At this moment, the COVID-19 pandemic provides a unique opportunity to transform the sector by aligning recovery actions with the Paris Agreement and the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. Ambition towards a 1.5-degree temperature goal by transitioning towards carbon neutral development and greening the tourism sector through the deployment of renewable energy technologies. Green facilities could lead to economic growth, create jobs, lead to efficient use of resources, and build resilience to climate change. Furthermore, as the pandemic threatens sustainable development gains, mainstreaming the Sustainable Development Goals into national policies to support recovery is even more crucial. Excuse me. Secondly, strengthened partnerships and coordination is vital for a resilient tourism sector. The pandemic affects both developed and developing countries, which emphasizes the need for greater partnerships at the national and local level, public and private partnerships, and international cooperation. The development of robust travel protocols developed by all stakeholders, especially health experts, can safeguard public health for communities and travelers while efficiently running a safe tourism reopening. Thirdly, people and the environment should remain at the center of recovery now more than ever. People and the environment. Notwithstanding public health, protecting nature, which is at the heart of our tourism product, should be reflected in recovery by promoting ecosystem-friendly practices and ecotourism. Furthermore, the pause in tourism has placed a deficit in entrance fees to sites, which normally supports environmental conservation, and has led to a greater need to address the consequent challenges. There is the potential for buffer communities on the fringes of protected areas and who rely on income from the sale of crafts or generated through cultural festivities to resort to illegal exploitation of forest resources in order to survive. Equally important for recovery, vulnerable groups, including women and youth, should be given high priority and consideration. Putting people first by protecting livelihoods is therefore essential and can serve as a model for recovery. Putting people first by protecting livelihoods. Lastly, innovation and technology have the potential to sustain tourism. Jamaica's plan to support COVID-19 recovery includes the availability of funding from multilateral partners and international institutions for small and medium enterprises. Barbados has a similar plan. In the Pacific, the Seychelles has postponed payment of specific tourism taxes to cope with the crisis. As the world ventures into a virtual mode of work, the remoteness of communities in SIDS presents challenges to maximize the use of technology. SIDS rely on partnerships to enhance our capacity to compete globally in this new format. In conclusion, while safeguarding public health remains a priority for recovery, partnerships and people-centered policies is crucial to transform the tourism sector into a green and resilient sector. So
Thank you.
I take this opportunity to thank the organizers, and I thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Excellency. This brings us to the end of our first opening segment. It is with pleasure that I now pass the floor to Gabriela Cassola, Acting Director of the Small States Center of Excellence, who shall be moderating the next segments of today's event. Gabriela, over to you.
Greetings from Valletta. On behalf of the Small States Center of Excellence, I would like to join Patrick in thanking you for joining us. Tourism is truly a lifeline for all SIDS across all levels of development, representing anything between 30 to 90%, as Ambassador Young has just told us. She has also made reference to the UNSG policy brief on tourism, which was published in August 2020 and which encouraged us all to seize the current challenge as an opportunity for transformation, underpinned by people, partnerships, and policies. We will attempt to examine these aspects with the help of our distinguished panelists. In order to kick off, we have asked the National Statistics Office of Malta to help us decipher the statistics and to set the ball rolling for our debate. Alan Cordina. Alan, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you. Thanks, Gabriela, and good morning or good afternoon to all participants. So at the last webinar, I presented statistics that showed that weighing the confirmed cases and deaths of COVID does not really make justice to the havoc that COVID brought, not just to the perceptions of health and the sensitivities on health, but also to the national and international economies. So international trade, transport, mobility were all affected, and these in turn affected national economies, such as we saw last time, government abilities to maintain economic stability in general, and in particular, a good and sustainable healthcare system. One of the sectors that contributes to the growth of national economies, and as we see later that of SIDS in particular, is tourism. And statistics show very clearly how the touristic sector was and still is affected by COVID. So to really understand the problems in the touristic sector now, we first need to see how the strength of touristic before COVID in 2019. So a simple time series shows that international tourist arrivals have from 950 million in 2010 increased steadily to a bit less than 1.5 billion in 2019. So similarly, international tourist receipts, and the yellow line here, increased from $980 billion in 2010 to $1.5 trillion in 2019. So the increase was linear for tourist arrivals and less steady for receipts, but they both came together by 2019. So taking the total exports from tourism, this is international receipts plus passenger transports in 2019, amounted to a bit less than $1.7 trillion, which translates in a share of 7% of total exports. So the percentage change of exports show that there was always a positive change, with one exception in 2015. but it is evident that in some years, tourists not only increased, but they also spent more. So data also shows that the direct and indirect jobs in the touristic sector increased from 260 million in 2010 to approximately 320 million in 2019. And this increase was necessary to cater for the increase of the number of tourists. And 320 million is approximately a share of 10% of total employment. So if we look at how this translates to SIDS, taking a look at SIDS, international arrivals increased from 250 million in 2010 to nearly 45 million in 2018. All regions had a different level of increase, but together they experienced an increase in tourist arrival of approximately 65%, more than the world increase, which stood a bit less than 50%. Also, the average annual growth for SIDS, which is at 8%, was higher than the average annual growth of international tourism, which stood at 6%. So tourism is definitely important, as we heard, and the multiplier effects of tourism and the effects and the ramifications are huge. So revenue from the tourism sector, which falls under exports, was not the same for all SIDS grouping. For instance, for the Pacific, it was a bit less than, the percentage share was a bit of less of 15% here, but the taking them together, the export revenue amounted to approximately $55 billion, which is nearly 8% of total exports, slightly more than the world share, which stood at 7%. In 2018, revenue from the touristic sector in all SIDS contributed to nearly 9% of the GDP. In the Caribbean region alone, it contributed to the GDP nearly 13%, much more than the world share, which stood at just at 2%. So the touristic sector provided for nearly a total of 3.4 million jobs. Again, this varied per region, but none of the group showed any decrease in employment since 2010, or at least until 2019, with direct or indirect, which is directly or indirectly related to the touristic sector. The touristic share of total employment was high in all regions, 27% in the Caribbean, and 24% in the AIS region, and 20% in the Pacific, which is much higher than the world share, which in 2019 stood at 10%. Well, this ended in 2019, really, and then 2010 brought COVID, and unfortunately, this halted the positive trend. So comparing Q1 of 2019 with Q1 2020, from a global perspective, tourist arrival decreased by 23%, and in SIDS by 31%. Grouping SIDS per region, the largest decrease was by 38% in the AIS region. April 2020, practically everything stopped, and tourist arrival decreased by 97%, both from a world perspective and also from the perspective of SIDS. This is when compared with the April data of 2019. So the 10 most vulnerable destinations are those that their exports are most reliant on tourism. And these happen to be all small island development states. Seeing just St. Lucia, its share is, its touristic share is that of 93%. And that is quite a big share. So less tourism translates into loss of jobs, and loss of foreign exchange and revenue, and the capacity for public spending and for sustainable livelihoods. So in the World Economic Outlook, of April 2020, the IMF project a GDP decrease in SIDS of nearly 4%. And the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs estimates that SIDS economies could shrink even by 4.7% in 2020. So tourism is mostly dependent on the opening of borders. The scenarios released by the World Trade Organization, World Tourism Organization, point to a decrease of 58% even in the best scenario, that the opening of borders and the lifting of travel restrictions would have happened in July. Now in July, there are still travel restrictions and there were still travel restrictions, and therefore the annual change by the end of this year would rest at a decrease of, it's estimated that it would rest at a decrease of between 70 and 78% in tourist arrivals. I mean, that is just brief statistics on how tourism was before COVID and now after COVID. It definitely shows that the revenue of small island development states cannot really cope for public expenditure and to deal with its existing concerns. I mean, not just COVID, they also have had different problems before COVID. Wasn't everything perfect before COVID. So this data shows that obviously the tourism sector needs to be addressed as to give impetus again to the increase in GDP and to the economic sector in general. That's all, Gabriella, thanks.
Thank you, Alan, for those interesting infographics and trends. So we will now pass on to the third segment of our debate. And our first panelist is the current president of the International Small Island Studies Association, ICISA, and former UNESCO co-chair in Island Studies at the University of Prince Edward Island in Canada. Joining us from Prince Edward Island, Canada, Professor Baldacchino. Professor Baldacchino, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Cassola. Your Excellencies, Under Secretary General Yu Zhenmin, and High Representative Fekita Utoya Kamanu, Ambassadors Fraser and Young, my colleagues on the panel, and the over 80 participants, I believe, that are attending this webinar. Greetings, it's 11 o'clock here, Prince Edward Island, Canada, Canada's smallest province. A pleasure to be here and take part in this exercise. Reflecting on the situation of tourism in the context of small island developing states, looking at the situation on the ground, learning from what has happened in the past and the time trends, so ably illustrated by my Maltese colleague, Alan Cordina, and of course, looking at the immediate and long-term future, what beckons, what is at stake. Mr. Cordina focused his data trends on the last 10 years or so. If he were to push back a little bit further into time and include the global financial crisis of 15 to 12 years ago approximately, we may have seen a blip in the tourist figures, in some cases a very serious dip. And that would be the most recent case, in fact, of a serious global crisis that affected mobility, standards of living in many countries, leading to severe reductions in the ability of people to spend money particularly on tourism. I'm saying this because, of course, today we are looking at the pandemic of 1918 as the closest equivalent to the coronavirus pandemic. However, as I understand it, the nature of tourism statistics going back in time 100 years doesn't really make much sense. So the closest example to look at what has happened in order to learn from the past to inform the future is the global financial crisis. What usually happens is that, of course, you live through a crisis, eventually the crisis is over. So historically speaking, every crisis is a blip. And tourism has typically emerged, not just emerged to the same levels, pre-crisis, but continuing an upward trend. So if all goes well, and it's a big if, of course, there are many unknowns. The when is one of the big unknowns. The upward trend is likely to proceed further. Are the participants able to see my slides?
Not yet, no.
Okay.
Now we are.
All right,
Yes.
fantastic. So I'll be able to refer to these as I go along. I just have one page. I like to keep my points fairly succinct, just teasers usually to provoke thinking and reflection. And then hopefully there will be some questions and answers later on. So I'm looking at a situation right now whereby many small island developing states have actually exploited the virtues of their isolation from a health perspective. So while being small and remote, etc., is not usually heralded as economic advantages, they certainly have proved to be, in a way, advantages as far as health is concerned. Indeed, if I'm not mistaken, there are still about a dozen small island developing states, particularly in the Pacific, that continue to be COVID-free. So the pandemic hasn't actually even reached their shores. And this is a virtue, I'm sure. It's something that they will be able to proudly boast about. And possibly when the good times come back, and they will come back, this is something that will be of a net advantage. Countries that have managed to remain healthy in the context of what is happening around us will be able to brag about this, and this will work in their favor. So there are virtues in isolation that we need to take on board. Of course, pulling up the drawbridge, as I say in my slide, has momentous consequences on countries that are defined by being surrounded by water. So once you close your port, you close your airport, then you have to be self-sufficient in many respects. Even trade has suffered because of the pandemic. So obviously things have changed, whether we like it or not. And even though we may not have been prepared, people have to respond. They have to fall back on what we call resilience. And I'd like to make the point that it is not industries as such that are resilient, it's the people in them that are. People have a natural knack for trying to survive in the best way possible, developing a livelihood for themselves and their families, those who are dependent on them. And we can see now we have the advantage of a few months of the COVID world, the COVID era, and we have seen people taking solutions. We have seen people taking some control over their lives, even as they face unemployment in some cases. And some of the evidence is for all to see. They include staycations. Some people refer to these as holistays instead of holidays, encouraging domestic tourism. There are bubbles and corridors, some of them within countries, some of them within archipelagos, some of them across countries and archipelagos, in order to facilitate some tourism. You will have noticed from the statistics just presented that tourism hasn't shut down 100%, for example. Tourism has only shut down, 98% in the worst cases. So there is still some tourism going on. Much of it could be domestic. And much of the domestic tourism could actually not be reported as tourism. We also talk of deliveries. So restaurants, for example, those in the catering and hospitality business, which offer services, some of those operations have moved to online services, online platforms, as well as physical deliveries. Instead of you going to eat in the restaurant and enjoy your sushi at the restaurant, you can get your sushi delivered to your door, if those catering facilities have made the switch to that kind of service. Serving spaces have been opened also outdoors. There are certain restaurants which, subject to government restrictions, of course, are able to operate and practice social distancing while serving in the open air. We also have, in a way, a return to slow food. I think we are witnessing a renaissance of domestic culinary traditions, the domestic cuisine. People once again recognizing that there are things that they can eat, which are good for them and healthy, which have always been available perhaps. But in the context of globalization, they may have played a second fiddle kind of role. Now suddenly they are more in demand because they are available and they represent a source of sustainable protein. We have also seen examples of economies where the individuals involved in tourism, given that they don't have any work right now, they have fallen back on other traditional activities. Notably among these is farming, petty agriculture, animal husbandry, as well as artisanal fishing, for example. Okay? These are practices that exist in many small island states. They may have not held up in the face of the growth of tourism. However, they have always been there. And some of the people that we are talking about, while they may be working in tourism, they may also have a side job, petty employment, or even self-employment, fishing, farming, and doing other odd jobs. This is a good also moment in time to reflect about the nature of our tourism industries, who is making the money, who is benefiting from tourism. In some cases, before the pandemic, some of us were scratching our heads because we were struggling with environmental degradation resulting from tourism, erosion of historical sites, too many tourists perhaps, right? Remember, in small states, a relatively small number, a small absolute number of visitors can make a huge impact, for better or for worse. So this was already a good time, I think, to reflect about the quality of tourism that we want to operate, that we want to offer. And this is where the partnerships issue comes in. I know it's one of the themes connected to this webinar. The idea of a SIDS compact, for example, proposed by Ambassador Young. I think it's a very good idea, trying to encourage donor states to facilitate the transition of economies that depend too much on tourism to diversify. I think this is one of the key points of my presentation. There is huge vulnerability in many states precisely because tourism is simply too big. There is no cushion, there is no alternative economic sectors that stand beside tourism in terms of importance, in terms of employment, in terms of revenue. So it's time to do something about this. This is a good time to start diversifying into other services, particularly services where being small and being peripheral and being an island does not work as a disadvantage, right? And this would therefore prepare these economies with the help that they deserve in order to face the post-shutdown era. Even debt swaps, I think, are a very interesting possibility. They should be considered, they should be mainstreamed in many other situations, facilitating the transition of economies into more circular economy models and prototypes, advancing a green, blue, carbon neutral, or even I would dare say a carbon negative growth. It is even quite possible for small island states to champion the cause of carbon, not just neutrality, but even negativity. These are things that can happen. I will conclude here. I don't think I have exceeded my 10 minutes, so this should give more time for question and answer and discussion later on. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Baldacchino. Definitely very, very insightful. And I think my personal takeaway from your presentation are two. Industries are not resilient, people are. And I think that holds forth for pretty much all of the SIDS. And also carbon negative growth. I find that extremely interesting. So we'd like to remind all attendees that our questions are to be put in via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens or via the chat function. 2020 was designated by UNWTO as the Year of Tourism and Rural Development. Who would have said? Ahead of World Tourism Day, which is celebrated later this month, UNWTO is committing to driving tourism as a force to truly leave no one behind. Joining us from Madrid, Spain, we welcome Michelle Julian from the Tourism Market Intelligence and Competitiveness Unit of UNWTO. Michelle, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to share this very interesting webinar with distinguished panelists, with distinguished colleagues from the UN and representatives, of course, from the tourism sector. Of course, I would like to thank the Small States Center of Excellence to organize this webinar. I think there's no better place than Malta, which is not only a major island destination in the Mediterranean, but also a very dynamic member of the UNWTO. So thank you very much for the opportunity. I will share some slides with you because there are some numbers, and I think it will be more practical to show it in some slides. So it's about restarting tourism in SIDS. I mean, we have seen the devastating effect of COVID-19, which is an unprecedented phenomenon in the history of has led to enormous social and economic consequences. As you know, Utoya, as you correctly said, Gabriela, is a specialized agency of the United Nations based in Madrid. And the mission is to promote a responsible, sustainable, and accessible tourism. That's why I think the year of rural tourism in 2020 also has a tremendous importance nowadays that we are seeing the rise, for instance, of domestic tourism, the importance of sustainability also, and the connection also with the rural tourism, as Professor Godfrey Balanchino said previously. But let's share some figures that Alan Cordina also mentioned. During January-May, we had a 56% drop in international tourist arrivals compared to 1.5 billion that was reached, of course, in 2019. And that's also in only 5 months, which means that that scenario which Alan Cordina just mentioned of 58% maybe will not be accomplished. But if you see the regions, the pandemic has had an impact in all regions of the world. In Asia and the Pacific, first, because it was the first hit region by the pandemic. So you see a minus 60% less international tourist arrivals, but also Europe with minus 58, the Americas with minus 47, Africa 2, and the Middle East minus 52. So which means that many destinations and many also urban markets are now at a standstill. I mean, the COVID pandemic has put both destinations and urban market at a standstill with all the consequences it has. As you know, travel restrictions were almost everywhere in April and May, with nearly all destinations in the world with travel restrictions and results of near 100%, minus 100% international tourist arrivals in those 2 months. This leads to 3 scenarios, which depends, of course, of the gradual opening of borders, the lifting of travel restrictions, and those 3 scenarios for 2020. And as you know, we don't have a crystal ball. It's very unpredictable because there's a high uncertainty, points to a decrease in international arrivals of between 60 to 80%, or to be more precise, 58 to 78%. Of course, this has some consequences in not only in the number of international tourist arrivals, in the decrease of tourist arrivals in the world, but also in the loss of receipts. And as you know, receipts in international tourism for the destinations are considered as poor revenues from tourism. So it is estimated that a potential impact in receipts will be a loss of 910 billion to 1.2 trillion loss in export revenues from tourism. But last but not least, also, it will put at risk 100 to 120 million direct tourism jobs. So these are major figures that we need to take into consideration especially if we talk about SIDS. And let's see what are the key figures for SIDS. Well, they received 44 million international tourist arrivals. That was in 2019, which represented 55 billion in exports from international tourism. And of course, you can see the large share of exports in total exports, and exports, tourism exports in total exports is 14 out of 38 SIDS. It's more than 50%, and it can reach even 80 to 90%. And of course, not only exports, but also the GDP. If you have the case of the Maldives, where it's almost 60% of the GDP of the Maldives. So it's huge. As you can see, 47% were recorded, less in international tourist arrivals for January, April, and that's only in 4 months. In this graph, we can see that international tourism revenues as a source of exports is very important. It can represent up to 90% in, for example, St. Lucia, or more than 80% in the Maldives or the Bahamas or Palau. So it has a considerable impact in the economy and the livelihoods also of these islands. And as Ambassador Lois Young mentioned at the beginning, there are 5 priorities which belong to the roadmap. What are the 5 priorities for recovery to build back better and stronger? Well, as you know, the UN Secretary General released a policy brief on COVID-19 and the impact of tourism and the transformation also of tourism, which was also authored by UNWTO. And as Ambassador Lois Young mentioned, the first one is to manage the crisis and to mitigate the socio-economic impact on livelihoods. And women and young people are especially vulnerable in island states because they represent a large share in the total employment of many SIDS. So the second priority is to boost competitiveness and build resilience. And I hope we will have the chance now during the discussion and the Q&A to talk a little bit more about it. The third is to advance innovation and digitalization of the tourism ecosystem. This is a priority of our Secretary General, Mr. Zurabpolo-Likashvili. But of course, we have to foster sustainability and green growth, inclusive green growth. And last but not least, partnerships. I think the way forward is to collaborate, to work together, to transform tourism and achieve, of course, those SDGs in 2030. Just to finish, you can access the website of UWTO, and you can consult and download for free the Tourism in SIDS. That's a report that we released in June with data and information about the importance of SIDS, but also about the measures to support the recovery of tourism, which is fundamental. Government support also to stimulate the recovery. If we talk about data, data is important. We need data. In an uncertain situation, we need to know what is happening, what could happen in the future, and what are those small changes in trends. And we see that we have here the UNWTO Tourism Data Dashboard that can help also to deliver those data and those measures implemented by countries to stimulate recovery. And we have done, of course, a lot of work in the travel restrictions, in the recovery technical assistance package, and I think we will have the chance also to maybe discuss it later. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michelle, for that intervention. Definitely, there are a lot of numbers which do give us a lot of food for thought and which will definitely help guide the panel forward to really address, to get to the crux of the matter. Without further ado, we will pass on to the next panelist. He is an international developmental economist with extensive experience working alongside and with SIDS. If you happen to have in-person meetings with him, do be careful because he really knows his Ds. Thank you, Twitter, for that. Delivering his presentation from New York, Riyad Medef from UNWTP. Riyad, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Gabriella. First of all, Excellencies, Ambassador Young, Ambassador Frazier, Ambassador Webson, and ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to thank my friend Gabriella and the Small State Center of Excellence, our strategic partners, OHLLS, and UNDSA for inviting UNDP. I would like to make a PowerPoint presentation. I don't know if it can be online. Is it online now, Gabriella?
Yes, it is. Absolutely.
Thank you very much. So I fully agree with what Excellency Ambassador Lois Young, Chair of AUSIS, has said from the beginning. Next slide. The most important thing that we are facing is true based on the number that Alan has presented and our colleague from UNWTO, that the part of the tourism in the economy of a SIDS is extremely important, but it's also a vulnerability in the sense that any external shock will impact any future of the economy in the SIDS. The most important thing that we need to do is try to reimagine what kind of tourism we could have and not just thinking about reopening of the tourism sector. I fully understand that it created a lot of unemployment in those small island developing states, but the COVID-19 pandemic is an opportunity for all of us to think with the SIDS and supporting really the SIDS to try to think what could be the new development model that they can adopt. And for that, I think having a compact or having a real Marshall Plan for the small island developing states is a key element. Without that, it is impossible for the SIDS, whatever the solution we offer, to try to implement it, because the part which is the importance part of the GDP for the SIDS impact their fiscal, the fiscal space. The fact that they don't have a fiscal space, they don't have revenue for funding their green recovery. And this is something very important. We need to think about the tourism sector linked to the other sector. The impact of the pandemic is a macroeconomic impact, is the social impact, but is also an environmental impact and a political impact in the small island developing states. The small island developing states need to be recognized for their vulnerabilities, and their dynamic vulnerabilities that's why it is very important to try to identify a multidimensional vulnerability index to recognize their specificity for them to access to finance and to try to restructure their tourism model and try to restructure their economies. Next, the importance also that the fact it impacted all the country, but it impacted also women at the highest level. They represent 54% of the workforce. And it's not only on the direct job, but it's also on the informal sector, which is a key element. And the loss of revenue for biodiversity conservation and the pressure on cultural heritage conservation is extremely important. Next slide, please. So, how do we reimagine tourism to benefit to societies and ecosystem? How can we create a tourism sector that is in symbiosis with nature, as Ambassador Young talked about it, but integrated into national economies and preserve cultural dignity of communities and ecosystem? First of all, the first pillar that we see is the blue economy. The blue economy as a framework for innovation and conservation. As you may know, that 77% of human energy needs can be met by the ocean. And that is something which is very clear. Similar to land protected area, tourism can provide a source of income to local communities to protect marine areas, linking them to activities like sport, whales, other species watching, but also scientific tourism through the blue economy. So that is beyond the sun and sea and sand. The second pillar that we think, which is important for imagining tourism, and Professor Baldassari mentioned it, is the innovation and digital transformation. How to expand the digital creative industry. The digital creative industry model are linked to cultural heritage tourism and can support funding for preserving cultural heritage. This is a key element for transforming, for example, in the case of the Caribbean, their tourism. And this is a key element for innovating the tourism, having a tourism more integrated in the national economy, more in symbiosis with the culture of the country. The second element also is digital upscaling and rescaling. We have currently programs where we are supporting all the people who lost their jobs to try to upscale their skills through digital trainings and giving certificates. And finally, conservation via big data and analysis. And that is a key element. We have developed the UN Biodiversity Lab, which allow you to can see the loss in biodiversity and how we can protect the biodiversity. This is a very key element for the future of the tourism. As Ambassador Young mentioned, the chair of IUSIS, biodiversity and nature are the main asset of the SIDS. The other element, two last elements that I think are essential is one, the green growth. The green growth is one of the key elements that you need to have. The tourism sector enforces a sustainable business model, but the industry has also sparked flagship initiative protecting natural and historical assets. So access to renewable energy can create a lot of jobs. That is a key element and linked completely to the tourism. Smart building and infrastructure, circular economy, how to eliminate completely from the small island developing states, the plastic. Responsible tourism for consumer through technology, that we can, so social media, educate tourists in respecting the culture of the country and better consume what is in the country. Support preservation and biodiversity is another element. Social protection and gender. The fourth pillar that we see is how to support especially informal workers, linking their situation to social protection mechanism, recovery strategy that mainstream gender to advance women equality. Finally, how is UNDP is partnering to safeguard livelihood during COVID-19? We have developed different initiatives, online tourism job training in the Pacific, as I mentioned previously, in partnership with our colleague from UNCDF, South Pacific Tourism Organization, Australian Pacific Training Coalition, where we provide virtual reskilling courses for tourism workers left unemployed. The Iuwto initiative in the Caribbean is a key element where we link, for example, farmers and fishermen and taxi drivers in order for them to not lose the job and recreate a platform of e-commerce. Next slide. Looking forward, that is the last slide. Looking forward, key partners on the pathway towards sustainable and resilient tourism in SIDS. We need to disrupt the current model of tourism, creating more sustainable, local, inclusive solution, and a new dialogue among the different stakeholders through enhanced partnership. One, by supporting local trade network and empowering community groups, especially the agriculture and food value chain, to have reduced the leakage of tourism activities, especially in international tourism hotel chains. Second, the regional tourism network is one of the key elements, including creating regional travel bubbles like New Zealand is trying to do in the Pacific, encouraging regional and domestic tourism like the Vani tourism in the Indian Ocean. And finally, private-public partnership to support digitalization. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you, Riyad, for that extremely interesting presentation and also for mentioning the partnerships, because that is a clue element that we would like to tackle in this panel. At this point, we are halfway through the panel, so I would like to ask our panelists whether there are any remarks, any comments that they would like to pass. Professor Baldacchino, do you have any questions or any remarks that you'd like to pass?
Well, since you asked me, Gabriela, I'm really enjoying this. I'm fully in tune with what is being said. My ears twitched a little bit when there was a reference to the vulnerability index. I don't think we should go down that route. That is something that SIDS exploited, I think, as best as they could in the 1990s and the early years of the 20th century. I don't think it works well in the long term, because proclaiming vulnerability is not a good flag to raise if you're trying to attract investment. It doesn't help. It makes more sense to exploit your strengths, see what, carry out a gap analysis, see where investment is needed and so on, and stop basically, trying to convince the world and yourself that you're incapable of, well, a lot of things. It's a deficit paradigm that I think has run its course. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Baldacchino. Riyad, no, we have lost Riyad for a moment. So we will, okay, unless there are any other comments from the panelists. Ambassador Young, do you have any comments?
Sorry, I was trying
No
to
worries.
Yes, I just listened to what Riyad said, and I have to agree that we need to disrupt the current model of tourism, and that gels with certain things that Professor Baldacchino said that I agree with in his first intervention. I'll take issue with him on what he said about the vulnerability index. It has a special purpose. We're working on it, but we can discuss that offline, Professor. But certainly the trend of what you said in the beginning and what Riyad has said is disrupt the current model. We need to make it sustainable and revise what we're doing and bring in local networks, local trade networks and regional trade networks. So, and I want to say too that I want to thank the Small States Center of Excellence for this initiative and the co-partners and DESA and OHR LLS, because this is extremely useful information. This is tangible. This is the stuff we need to be talking about more. We need to drill down on these issues. This is really good. So thanks.
Thank you, Ambassador Young. Thank you. I would also like to thank the permanent representative of Malta to the UN, who has also, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who have really assisted in putting this up together. It was a team effort, SIDS style, as we'd like to say. So we have, okay, I see that Riyad is back with us. Okay, Riyad, do you have any comments before we pass on to the next panelist? Okay, Riyad?
Yes, sorry, I wanted to disrupt the tourism model and I got disrupted completely, so I lost my connection. So I really apologize. I don't know if there was a question or not. I couldn't hear it.
Okay, it was about the vulnerability index, whether it is worthwhile going down that road, because Professor Baldacchino was mentioning how that was also kind of used and exploited in the 1990s, and whether it is worth going down that route now, and whether it could be useful towards attracting investment towards SIDS.
I do not think there is any possibility you go back to the last classification of the World Bank of the countries by revenue, 1st of July, and you will see only 2 SIDS are low-income countries, 27 are middle-income countries, the rest are high-income countries. But all those countries, look at them seriously. They don't have access to constitutional financing, which is main recommendation of the political declaration of midterm review of Samoa pathway. We cannot have that only on paper without having actions. We need to have actions. And for them to be able to recover and develop a new model of tourism, they need to have access to finance. It's exactly what Iuwto's group is pushing. We need to have access to cheap finance to be able to develop. If in one side we ask them to change their model, on the other side we block them because they cannot have access to concessional financing, this is very complicated. So that's why we all need to support the SIDS, to try to support this SIDS Compact or SIDS Marshall Plan by giving all the tools for the SIDS to decide and lead their future. They are really leading their future. They exactly know what they want, but we need to support them in that sense because this is a key element. And the multidimensional vulnerability index, which was not done for all the SIDS, but for all the countries. The idea is to develop one for all the countries, but reflect the reality of all the SIDS, not only one region. There are around 12 multidimensional vulnerability index existing now, but we need to try to cover the maximum of the countries to be recognized. And this is a key element. And one of the other element is the restructuring debt instruments are important for the SIDS and access to innovative finance. Because the reality at the end, no access to money, you cannot have any possibility of restructuring, disrupting the tourism model and having new development model. We are not looking for diversification of economies in the SIDS. We are looking of transformation of development. And COVID-19 just highlighted the vulnerability. But there are many opportunities in the SIDS, especially climate action, blue economy, digital transformation.
Thank you, Riyad. We have also a question, in fact, coming in from Hilary Briffa. Could the panelists give more insight into this issue? They mentioned of the lack of fiscal space necessitating the need for a compact. So I don't know if any of the panelists would like to take that question.
Okay, so if I may very briefly, I'd like to try to answer this question while at the same time continuing the excellent comments being made by Riyad, because that is precisely the way to go. We're talking about a root and branch approach to economic transformation, but of course that needs to start from the things that are already on the ground, and tourism is very much on the ground. And the opportunities, I think, are there. So, you know, with broadband, with the internet, with the digital age, with information technology, many of the constraints, many of the structural handicaps that were at the basis of the vulnerability argument need no longer apply. I want to make this very clear. I don't think we should be straddled with a kind of a very, very heavy, low opinion of ourselves as small state, members of small states and island states, as being handicapped in being unable to proceed along certain economic development trajectories. Let us remind ourselves that in many cases, we built the tourism industries of our countries. It was not foreign investment as such. It was not some kind of, major debt commitments that led to tourism being developed in many of our states. We did that without also any special market forces, as against other industries. You know, when we try to export bananas, that was dependent on a particular agreement, for example, with particular reference to Caribbean countries. So let's keep this in mind and therefore understand that if there is a strong business case, you don't have to raise the vulnerability flag to get money. You make a strong business case, it will assist in the diversification and the transformation of small island economies and wean us away from the overdependence on tourism.
I fully support that view. And I want to suggest that, small businesses have been the key to opening up some of these tourism spaces. And you did mention, for example, the banana trade. It started right here in Jamaica on the backs of small farmers. And therefore, I fully agree with the sentiment that we have to be much more innovative and creative, and we can rebuild the industry. Doesn't, of course, ignore the importance of getting the kind of financial support and the arrangements that were mentioned. But I do think that we need to be much more positive in our outlook about the possibilities in the future.
Fully agree, thank you.
Thank you. So without further ado, we will take on the next slot of 3 panelists. Of course, we encourage all the participants to continue typing in their questions in either the chat or as the Q&A function. She is both an economist and a lawyer, has served as Jamaica's chief advisor to the Prime Minister, and has extensive experience within the micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. Joining us from Kingston, Jamaica, Dr. Rosalia Hamilton. Rosalia, all is on you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Co-chairs, excellencies, UN officials, fellow panelists, participants, thank you so much for inviting me to join this very distinguished panel. I think the pandemic has exacerbated pre-existing social and economic problems in the Caribbean. And these, of course, are linked to our inherited structural weaknesses, especially as it impacts the vulnerable groups like micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises, MSMEs. Those especially allied to the tourism industry. We're talking about entertainers, hairdressers, transport operators, farmers, cook shops, and so on. Now, before the pandemic, they had very limited capacity to compete and grow profitable businesses. All the data provided suggests that poor educational backgrounds, limited business skills, many with no collateral, with no land inheritance. Many had limited assets on which to grow the business, and we've seen data to suggest that this happens in a context of significant asset inequality that exists. Since the pandemic, the obvious fallout has been presented already from a macro perspective, but let me just highlight a recent study that was done in Jamaica. The significant loss to businesses and their families were picked up in a recent study by UNICEF in collaboration with the Caribbean Policy Research Institute. Just a few days ago, the findings were out. About 80% of households suffered a reduction in income, much of this from business loss. About 86% of those households were now relying on savings, but they reported, about half of them reported that these savings can sustain them for less than 2 weeks. So we know that much of those savings are now used up. We did studies to suggest that young entrepreneurs, we've worked with a group of them over the years, and we found that about 80 to 90% of them have no savings. And so the vulnerabilities with respect to young entrepreneurs are real. Many have closed their businesses. Of course, we expect some will be closed permanently. And those trying to survive are now finding the higher cost of operations as they mask up and sanitize and so on is not likely to lend to sustainability in the short run. Women-owned MSMEs are even more challenged. In addition to the business loss, many are finding themselves having to homeschool their children, care for the household, prevent COVID. Some of them are cooking 3-4 times a day because the family has been eating so much more. Those are some of the things that they've reported. And unfortunately, many women, with all of that, are managing abusive relationships. So I think when we look at the response, however, Caribbean states and as well as non-state actors have responded in various ways. And I just highlight 2 broad ways: the direct cash transfers and tax breaks. In Jamaica, we had a very elaborate care program, and we saw that these cash transfers were provided for vulnerable groups. There are also in-kind assistance, training and upskilling, especially digital skills. And there's also assistance to the businesses with the masks and sanitizers and so on, and a number of care packages. My own foundation and other foundations in Jamaica across the Caribbean were very active in providing care packages to homes. But I do think that the challenge is to build back better, is to tackle some of these pre-existing problems so that when we come back and we overcome this problem, those that were most vulnerable are in a better place. And I think there's some good news in all of this. because the dramatic changes taking place are creating new opportunities. So I would say in response, there are alternative business models for tourism that are evolving, that are being created. Just this week, Forbes reported that rich Europeans and Americans are flocking to the Caribbean, not for the usual short-term sun, sand, and sea, but for longer getaways and for changing lifestyles. So it's reported that some US citizens want to hide out to get away from COVID and the racial tensions, in fact, even the upcoming elections. And it was reported that the US inquiries for residential villas in one of the locations in Dominica jumped 66%. There are others that are looking for lifestyle changes and want to live on a dream island and work from a dream island, the so-called digital nomads. Many of them are online professionals wanting to work from home. We just saw that in July, Barbados launched a 12-month welcome stamp to attract remote workers to the countries. They found since then about over 1,000 applications, mainly from the US, Britain, and Canada. And so that's opened up some new opportunities. These temporary residents are now creating new opportunities for people who have Airbnbs, real estate agents, and other service providers are now have to create and invent and respond to their needs. There's growing interest in residency and citizenship by investment programs. About 7 Caribbean countries have these programs. And it was reported, the Banbridge accountants reported that about 6,000 Americans gave up their citizenship in the first half of the year. That represents about 1,000% jump over the previous 6 months and doubled the amount of persons last year, 2019. So I'm suggesting that new models are emerging. We do want to change those models, but just the realities are changing these models for us. And I think it will be more dramatic as we shift to more reliance on robotics, artificial intelligence, decision intelligence, and so on. Virtual reality technology is now being used to simulate and create 3D virtual tourism environments. And these are opening up great new opportunities for creative MSMEs. I look forward to a virtual island hopping tour where I can hop from Jamaica to Trinidad and Tobago and to Bahamas in the Caribbean, to the songs of reggae and calypso and jankono, and then hopping over to the Pacific Islands, to the Polynesian rhythms. All of those are now possible virtually. So I do agree with Riyadh that, you know, cutting edge technologies integrated with our cultural traditions and expressions are key. So for me, the partnerships that are critical are those partnerships that can foster and enhance these developments and to build the kind of resilient and secure touristic offerings that we want. And I strongly recommend philanthropic partnerships. These that can bring together financial and other resources in the private sector, the non-governmental organizations, faith-based organizations, and diaspora organizations. These are among the organizations that we in the Caribbean Philanthropic Alliance are pulling together. We have created one such partnership. Our core objective is to harness financial and other resources to accelerate the achievements of SDGs and the Samoa pathways in the Caribbean by 2030. So we're actually doing this. And I think it does include activities that can transform tourism in the future, and in so doing, transform MSMEs, as well as the inherited underlying structures that have limited the capacity for MSMEs to do much more than it can. We in Jamaica think that we have the best music in the world, and we continue to complain that we need to do much more. And I think the world is waiting for us. We now have an opportunity to redefine ourselves in the global landscape. That's the opportunity that I see. So the Caribbean Philanthropic Alliance stands willing and ready to partner to propel resilience forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rosalea. I have to say that definitely there are a lot of people in the chat who do agree that Jamaica has the best music in the world from what we're saying. So that's definitely have a lot of support on that one. Joining us next from Malé, Maldives, we are thrilled to have the Deputy Minister of Tourism, Dr. Naushad Mohammed. Deputy Minister, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Kasoga. Greetings from the Maldives, Excellencies, UN ambassadors, and participants. I will focus on how the COVID-19 has impacted the Maldives and how the Ministry of Tourism has responded in managing the pandemic and sustaining our economy. To begin with, Maldives have been hit hard by COVID-19. There has been a dramatic fall of international tourist arrivals with closure of border and inability to contain the spread of COVID-19 across the globe. Generally, countries like Maldives that depend heavily on tourism for national income are more likely to ease travel restrictions. From 87 destinations that eased restrictions recently, 20 destinations are small island developing states similar to the Maldives that depend heavily on tourism for national income. Although we received 1.3 million tourists in 2018 and 1.7 million in 2019, in 2020 we have received only 392,176 tourists by the end of August. This is mainly due to the fact that our border were closed for full 3 months, from April to June. We have reopened our borders for international tourist arrivals on 15 July. However, this was restricted to isolated tourist resorts only. The government has now decided to allow arrival of international tourists to hotels and guest houses in local islands on 15th October. Furthermore, the government has decided to require a negative PCR test for all tourists from 10th September onwards. As a government, the biggest challenge has been the dual responsibility of prioritizing public health to manage the pandemic and at the same time stimulate economic activities through tourism to local island communities. The SARS outbreak in 2003 did not reach Maldives, and therefore we are inexperienced in responding to a health pandemic of this scale, affecting directly on tourism. There was a real challenge in deciding the point at which we decide on closure of borders and complete closure of tourist facilities. Managing the pandemic calls for a lot of pressure in managing our limited resources. Reopening of guest house tourism makes it even more challenging when it comes to remote and isolated islands with understaffed and limited health support. When we are debating on whether to reopen guest houses for international tourist arrivals, it is important to highlight that like no other comparable economic activity, tourism has the highest potential to revive local island economic activities in the Maldives. There are 166 tourist resorts, 14 hotels, and 630 guest houses, and 160 safari vessels in the Maldives. However, currently only 90 resorts remain in operation, 3 hotels, 102 vessels, 30 transit facilities. In total, 230 facilities remain active. In a survey on the impact of COVID-19 in local island tourism by the Guest House Association of Maldives, it showed that 66% of hotels in local islands are financed by loan capital. With rent being a fixed cost, prolonged closure of operation has had a huge impact on the very survival of guest houses. COVID-19 has reduced average occupancy of 68% guest houses at the time of the survey. And 85% of the guest houses claim that if we do not allow arrival of international tourists to guest houses, they will have to close down in this year. Another important study, the Rapid Livelihood Assessment Impact of COVID-19 in the Maldives report that 44,954 payroll employees work in tourist resorts. Of these, 22,000 local employees work in resorts have been directly affected, and they were generally affected by redundancy, no pay, and retention. The World Bank estimates that Maldives has been most severely hit in South Asia region due to high exposure to industries most vulnerable to the outbreak. Talking about how the COVID-19 has affected how we promote the tourism and how we ensure the safety and safeguard of international tourists, I would like to first note on unity and connectedness of stakeholders. We established a national emergency operation body, which has been the largest multi-agency operation in the history of Maldives. Currently, it's called Health Emergency Operations Center. When talking about responses to mitigate the situation, in January, we established a situation monitoring unit. And we have been closely monitoring the development of the pandemic in the world. We are lucky that the first case of COVID-19 hit Maldives on March 7th, and we got some time to prepare for the pandemic. Initially, we allocated 24 resorts as isolation facilities, which were not in operation, to put tourists and locals in isolation facilities. Ministry of Economic Development provided financial support for those who has been affected, especially guest houses on average of 3 months revenue. An equivalent of 3 months revenue has been given to local hotels in local community islands, which has to be paid with 6% interest. Freelancers have also been provided finance to sustain an income. The initial reopening date after we closed the border was promoted in Barcelona versus Celta Vigo match, which helped us promote the fact that we are now open for international tourists. Despite disseminating funds to support tourist establishments to survive through the pandemic, these funds have been utilized primarily to manage recurrent funds such as utility bills, rent, and staff remuneration. Hence, although UNWTO encourages such funds to be utilized to build a resilient business model towards tourism recovery, we have not figured out how to support local tourist establishments to build resilience to future shocks in local island tourism. Post-COVID tourism has definitely called for priority on health and safety of tourists. We cannot dismiss the obvious anxiety of international tourists to travel. Despite Maldives being a popular tourist destination, we are conscious of the concern of first-time visitors to Maldives. To that end, we focus on building trust and transparency through communication of relevant and important information to potential tourists as well as industry stakeholders. The new tourism model in Maldives, especially in tourist resort islands with one island, one resort, has reduced the socializing elements of tourists. This is a huge challenge since the desire to interact and socialize with each other is an important part of the tourist experience in the Maldives. In local islands, sometimes it is a challenging task to convince the local communities of the importance of reviving tourism and reopening local hotels which support the very livelihood of these communities. With several communities that has previously engaged in farming and fishing as main source of income has given up these activities to set up a family guest house, often tied with financial debt. Currently, tourist facilities in local islands are primarily focused on international tourists replicating the tourist resorts. Instead, to build resilience, perhaps these guest houses should now remodel to attract domestic travel as their main target segment. Furthermore, while private sector can contribute immensely in achieving sustainable development goals, there's a deficiency in awareness and expertise to advance SDGs. Maldives in India have created the first air bubble in South Asia to facilitate movement of people between two countries. India is a major destination for Maldives seeking medical treatment, and in return, India, one of the major destinations for tourist arrivals to Maldives. Similar discussions are also on the way with China, Singapore, and Sri Lanka. Most tourist establishments in local islands lack expertise in promotion of their guest houses. So I believe from the SID community, I would like to ask for technical training to build a resilient business model, especially in local island communities. And these do not necessarily have to be in the health sector, but it can also be in maintaining health and safety, food processing, water sports, safe diving, and entrepreneurship as well. That brings a conclusion to my presentation. Thank you, Dr. Kesula.
Thank you, Dr. Mohammed, for your intervention. We'll now, without further ado, we'll pass on to the next panelist. He hails from the country with 365 beaches. He has been involved in tourism in his country for a good number of teen years. Joining us from New York, Dean Fenton, the US Director of Tourism for Antigua and Barbuda. Dean, over to you.
Thank you very much. Excellencies, UN ambassadors, co-chair, UN official, distinguished guests, I bring you a warm and beautiful Antigua welcome. I'm gonna actually divert my attention to the questions that was posed to the panel, because I realized that no one really addressed the 4 questions that was here. But before we do that, Antigua and Barbuda thus far has recorded 95 coronavirus cases, only 3 fatalities, and that's not bad for a destination of 100,000 people. So I think our government has to be commended on a beautiful job of containing this pandemic. Things have changed. We've never walked this road before. And I'm just going to give you an insight or a snapshot of what Antigua is doing to combat this situation. Going to question number 1, what deficiencies in Lucane have been brought to the force by the pandemic on the local tourism front, in particular in respect to existing or required partnership. On the local front, the Antigua government, this is what we've been doing thus far. On the local front of tourism, all hotels, restaurants, excursion, all attractions were forced to close because of the pandemic. With no feasibility or possibility of creating revenue during a complete shutdown. No alternative source of revenue in tourism and hospitality for in-person tourism. Investments were made for creating virtual experiences and tours, but these were complementary to the public to create a desire and drive for travel. Therefore, it remains unknown still if people would be willing to pay for virtual experiences and acts as a future source of income. Global shutdown highlighted that the entire model of tourism is reliant on current travel market rather than being able to create future revenue. While restaurants were able to stay open for carry-out only, this was the only source of revenue for business, as even beach activities was not allowed during the shutdown and curfew. From the US standpoint in regards to partnership, as for the US partnership, a lot of the travel agents are still furloughed. Most agents have been working in crisis mode without getting paid. Many travel agencies have closed and agents are switching careers and not selling travel anymore. It is very difficult to track the optimized media and agents database at this point. Most of our travel industry partners are not marketing because they are scared of losing more revenue doing so. Our cruise ship partners have not been in the water for the past 6 months. Everyone is on extensive pause or has gone dark. This includes all airlines, cruise ships, tour operators, travel agents, as well as regional and domestic travel. Upon reopening, it created the need to create even stronger partnership and connections across all arms of tourism, from government to the private sector, to the medical agencies, to the level that was unprecedented. Everyone needs to work together to ensure reopening was safe and everyone was properly informed. I'll move on to question 2. What measures and partnerships have been put in place to promote tourism and safeguard both employment and economic survival? Through working with partners in the private sector and stakeholders, Antigua and Barbuda created the Your Space in the Sun global campaign. And I'll just explain what that means. Antigua is 108 square miles. 95% of that is pristine coastline. So we've been practicing social distancing before it became a thing. And that speaks to the safety of vacation in Antigua and Barbuda. Like I said, 95 miles of pristine coastline, mostly boutique hotels, and no high-rise crowded resorts. Imageries and activations were supported through global partnership and agencies to maximize as much visibility as possible without paying for ads as it was not viable. Only certified hotels and taxis are in service at this point in Antigua. They were certified prior to opening Antigua and Barbuda to really ensure the safety of citizens and our guests. Some of the things the government is doing, or we're doing as a whole, is we're looking towards financial support from the government. Some of the things that we're doing, financial support from the government for workers who were unable to work during the shutdown, promoting our global renowned citizen by investment program, improving digital and financing sectors, innovating technology as it relates to apps. We're looking at young people, we're looking at young talented Antiguans and Barbudans to develop apps to help with tourism. We're also looking at agriculture, solar and green technologies, eco and sustainable tourism have been in place prior to COVID, which has helped us position what our Twin Island nation will continue to offer. Our 365 beaches, many resorts already had in place plenty of space, like I mentioned earlier, on site by original design, which is how we always have promoted Antigua and Barbuda. I will go on to question 3. What alternative models and tourism has the pandemic instigated, encouraged, or brought into effect? And what type of partnerships do these entail? Well, like someone said earlier in the panel, we're looking at staycations now on island. Hotels are offering great packages with deals for those in Antigua and Barbuda. Camping is also something that's been fashionable now. Some people say glamping because it's more glamorous, but it's camping as we know it. Further encouraging and promoting interregional travel because of the attractive flight time from our neighboring islands. So we're trying to encourage and promote more visitors from our neighboring islands because I think it's suppressed revenue that we've been sitting on for many, many years. So now our goal is really to market to those neighboring islands and really come up with some hefty deals for them. More farm to table partnership also with restaurants and hotels, benefiting local farmers. People are spending more time on their boats yachts, more solitary vacationing, more family retreats. We're looking at those models, more outdoor activity while on holidays, such as hiking, water sports, cycling, and outdoor wellness treatments instead of on-site gyms and spending time at heavily populated areas. The current tourism market has shifted to experiences that includes less contact with staff and other visitors. So increasingly, villas are becoming more trendy, private properties and away from, the buffet market, strengthening the partnership with the private sector to promote this new viewpoints on travel and raising awareness of services. Additionally, working with the private sector to institute new services to match the needs, such as removing buffet at all inclusives. Last but not least, question 4, what types of partnerships can be envisaged to put into place more resilience and secure touristic offerings? More industry partners. Our goal is to get more marketing done with industry partners, but with a dollar for dollar match. So if I put $1,000 up, they have to put $1,000 in. We have both to lose at this juncture. So I'm focusing more on a more dollar to dollar partnership with my tourism industry people moving forward. Better travel insurance has to come into play because a lot of people were put out because they didn't have insurance and stuff of that nature. Better airlines and hotel offerings has to be at the forefront. Better value for money promotion as opposed to traditional offerings. Critical in regaining trust is providing additional perks such as no charge for cancellation or change fees. We've seen this with the airlines industry, and we're working to implement in the hotel and accommodation sector. Better consideration has better co-share, I should say, with the airlines, so passengers in the future won't be stuck. Airlines needs to better position themselves, I think, moving forward. Safety and health has to be paramount. When people travel, safety becomes premium in every sector of tourism, and it is critical to work together to share exactly all of the procedures that are in place to ensure that the trust from the visitors, strengthening relationships with media, tour operators, and travel advisors by offering plenty of press and fam trips. I think for a lot of destinations to recover, we have to really get the media in, see what we're doing, get the travel agents in on FAMs so they could come back and report how great things are shaping up. I think that has to be one of the key driving forces once things flatten out. Again, more press and fam trips that will highlight specific areas and themes such as health and wellness, beaches, outdoor activities, and living like a local. They didn't want to see how we're living. And then, like I mentioned, the farm to table aspect of things. Creating digital and virtual tours with perks and extras that could possibly provide incentive for revenue or visitors to invest. Continued investment in sustainability and eco to ensure the destination will survive possible future crisis. And
thank you, Dean.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dean. Thank you. Thank you so much. So we have very few minutes before the end of this webinar. So what I'll ask all our panelists for a clear 1 minute. We will be actually ringing the bell at the expiry of the 1 minute. We have to be very drastic, but unfortunately time is really against us. And then we'll pass on to the closing remarks thereafter. So let's start with Riyadh. I know that you have to leave very soon, so perhaps you could start and just do a 1 minute from your end.
Thank you very much, Gabriela, and thank you very much for all the panelists. I have only one message, and it remains what the ambassador chair of Iuwto said. Yes, we want to disrupt the tourism model. yes, we are leading our development future. But yes, we need, and I like when she linked to the financing for development negotiation currently ongoing in the UN, we need support to access to financing. This is a key element if you want us to restructure our development. And one thing that which is a key message from the Placencia event, that was the last big event organized by the SIDS at the ministerial level, one of the key messages came from there and from the Secretary General of United Nations. Yes, COVID-19 highlighted the vulnerabilities of the SIDS, but the SIDS has opportunities, and they are on climate action, blue economy, digital transformation. Thank you very much.
Yes,
Professor
thank you, Gabriella.
yes.
Yes, thank you for organizing this event. I think it's been very useful, a very interesting combination of regional and country-specific interventions, but also global and far-reaching, also I would say cross-disciplinary, which is also very useful. It's not just tourism specialists, but also economists, development specialists, which have been on board. I welcome that exchange of information. I'll just conclude by a reflection on the fact that a pandemic, by definition, is a global thing. It's a global agent. But many responses to the pandemic have been woefully national. So states, of course, have done what they can, looking at what other countries are doing, taking advice, sometimes collaborating, but very rarely coming up with a global response. And this is, of course, the missing piece in the jigsaw puzzle, right? You can only handle a global threat effectively with a global response. And if that is not going to happen, then perhaps at least the small island developing states should get their act together. I reaffirm the reference to the SIDS Pact that was referred to by Ambassador Young. I think this is an excellent opportunity for small countries to realize they have huge commonalities, huge similar challenges, and they might be able to rise to the occasion more successfully, more robustly, more sustainably, if they manage to put together a common front. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Baldacchino. Rosalia Hamilton.
Yes, thank you so much for this invitation and this opportunity to have this dialogue. I would just want to say that now more than ever, we need to dig deep, be creative, forge new global linkages. I think we're still stuck in the Caribbean, in the traditional trade global arrangement that we've inherited. I think now more than ever, we need to do this. I think if we begin to look at this as an opportunity for change and grasp that opportunity, I think that we can do much more. We are resilient people coming out of a history that made us resilient. And I do believe that we can make the difference. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I must say before the 1 minute mark, well done for that. So we have Dean, 1 minute.
Sorry, I was muted.
We were trying to unmute you.
Yeah. I just want to say thank you for the opportunity. Antigua and Barbuda welcomes this, and we enjoy the opportunity to really showcase what we're all about. And also, I think moving forward, we need more, not platitude or pipe dreams, but real solutions. And I think we really have to hold our airlines responsible moving forward, because they've gotten away with murder. And a lot of people left stranded during this COVID situation. So I like to see us hold our industry and travel partners responsible moving forward.
Thank you so much, Dean. Michelle?
Yes, thank you. This is a wonderful opportunity to rethink tourism. But before, we need to think about restarting tourism, especially in those seats that are heavily relying on tourism. We need to save this lifeline for so many livelihoods in those islands. So we need to restart tourism by offering more government support with more financial resources, as Riyadh mentioned, with the collaboration of institutional organizations or bodies, financial institutions. Collaboration, public-private partnership is key in this recovery of tourism. And I will say that there are two key pillars for the recovery and to build a better and stronger tourism, which are innovation and sustainability.
Thank you so much. Last but not least, Dr. Mohammed.
Thank you. I would just like to highlight the importance, reiterate the point made by Mrs. Fakita about the importance of achieving economic diversification in SID group. Secondly, I would like to highlight that Maldives needs financial and technical support to build resilience into the tourism industry. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So without further ado, we would like to ask Ambassador Aubrey Webson, Permanent Representative of Antigua and Barbuda to the UN, to deliver his closing remarks. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Gabriela. I want to begin by thanking, first of all, the Maltese leadership for pulling this together, the Center of Excellence, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and my good friend, Ambassador Fraser, and her team for pulling this together. We have had a rich discussion that has crossed a lot of areas, tourism, but tying tourism into our economy. For most of us in the small island developing states, tourism is inextricably tied to a significant portion of our economy. We heard percentages of 60% in the Maldives. We heard 90% in some aspects of tourism in St. Lucia. We know that most of the Caribbean islands are amongst the 10 most dependent tourism countries in the world. So we know how important tourism is to our economies, and therefore a restart, a reset, a rebuild, a remodel of our tourism industry is critical. For every challenge, there is an opportunity. And with the challenge that we are now facing globally, the opportunity is obviously there before us to remodel our tourism industry and to reshape it to something that is less dependent upon the markets that we all have come to depend upon. And that may be fanciful. I think we have to understand that we are in a period where we no longer can just speak about ideas and fancy ideas. We are at a point now where we must come up with practical solutions. And we have heard some of those potential solutions mentioned here today, and we need to begin to explore them because we have populations in our societies, though small, we have populations that are dependent upon us, upon the industry, and are in fact suffering as a result of the fall of the industry. Unemployment in our tourism industry is exceedingly high and reflects on our societies, and it reflects on gender and the increased abuse of women. It reflects on our unemployment rates and therefore impacts our poverty status. And it is the most significant challenge that we, certainly in the Caribbean, and I believe all small states, have faced since independence. This is the most significant challenge, and coming out of this challenge, we must create new opportunities. I just wanted to say, and I felt in wrapping it up, that I must refer to the discussion on the vulnerability index. I think, as Ambassador Young said, we could have another discussion or a broader discussion. But for SIDS, the vulnerability index within the development structure and the economic strata of our society is critical to emphasize. We cannot get, it does not weaken us to say, I respectfully disagree. It does not weaken us to say that these our vulnerabilities are X and must be considered in our economic development and our social structures. It is not a theory, it's a practical, it's a fact. There are vulnerabilities that we face that we have to be able to address and ask the international community to address in working with us to address the questions of finance and to address the questions that we face in the COVID-19. The tourism failure is seen through the lenses of some of our vulnerability index. We do depend on tourism for foreign direct investment, and we need to address this. So at another time, I'm sure we can discuss this further. I think the point that was made that whether there are 11 or 12 different indices around, we need to bring those down so that we can all agree on what are the vulnerabilities within the index, and we can do that together. We made the world pay attention to climate. We must make the world pay attention to our needs. I want to thank the Center of Excellence, and I want to thank all colleagues on the panels for your tremendous contribution. This has opened up and will help us to continue our advocacy. I want to thank Ambassador Young and for her contribution from AOSIS, and Fakita for her contribution from OHR LLS. This has been a wonderful morning, and the partnership continues. We look forward to greater and further dialogue. I thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Webson. Thank you so much. So this draws up this. Thank you once again, obviously, to all the attendees who have joined us for our second webinar in a series. A recorded version of the webinar will be sent out to all registered participants. We have also taken note of the unanswered questions and answers, which we will attempt to redirect to our panelists over email and which we will duly share with all of you. The conversation will continue on our Twitter handle at CSSCOE_MT. Our tweetable for this evening is very simple. Creativity involves breaking out of established patterns in order to look at things in a different way. Thank you. Saha.
Thank you. Apologies, I was cut off, but thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, and well done, everyone.
Likewise.
Bye.
Thank you.